But we had a plan to use frequent flyer miles or just use those part of those tickets to make up for the shortfall in EIA for those who didn't hear. Want to thank the Peterson Institute for this opportunity, and Fred and the team here. I'm on the advisory board, and I think that the perspective that you've brought to bear on these questions is very valuable. Trevor, congratulations to you and your colleagues on a really excellent paper that I think puts by getting the equivalences, it helps a great deal to see how these things relate. I wanted to just offer a couple of comments, and then we'll turn to our two distinguished panelists. First, I think what really comes through is, as you suggest at the end, there isn't a single thing that ties it all together, but indeed you need all of them, a range of things, and then the impact is quite cumulative. It is striking in the precincts of the Peterson Institute that it turns out that the economist solution, a carbon tax, turns out in your calculations to actually be the single most effective thing you can do rather than a lot of other things. On domestic oil production, I think you emphasize it more in your presentation than the paper. And just as we've seen this rapid change in natural gas, which just 3 years ago was still being debated as to whether shale gas was for real or not, and now it's 25% of our national supply, we're seeing a rapid change, as you suggested in your presentation, on tight oil. And the numbers you had about North Dakota may have gone past people quickly, but North Dakota is now the fourth largest oil-producing state in the country, which wouldn't have been expected a couple of years ago. The Bakken Formation, which was 10,000 barrels a day 5 or 6 years ago, is today getting close, as your numbers are suggesting, to 400,000 barrels a day. And some people think that the U.S. could add as much as 2 million barrels a day of tight oil production, which would be equivalent to the Alaska pipeline at its peak. On the international picture, the one thing that I was a little struck that wasn't in there, and maybe you'll come back and comment on it, was the role of Canada and Canadian oil sands. Are the largest source of U.S. oil imports today is a country that didn't exist in the 1970s, which is Canadian oil sands, and that buildup is very significant. And so when you think about the shape of the world oil market, that's an important addition. The other thing that's in the paper that you didn't have time to cover, but I think you raised the question about the changing structure of the world oil market, the role of China and India, and you suggested something that would surprise some people, I think, the role of China and India in sharing with the U.S. The burden of protecting and patrolling and ensuring freedom of sea and the sea lanes. And I think that really ties into the last part of your paper, in which you talked about the continuing reliance that will exist, and therefore the question of the stability of the market. Obviously, you ended about very vividly the role of the EIA. There was quite a sharp critique of the EIA this week, and I wondered if you just, before I turn to our panelists, if you want to respond to it or have any thoughts on that.
Sure, I can say something fairly quickly. I think for those who haven't tracked this, so what Dan's referring to is in some New York Times reporting about shale gas development, there were a lot of internal EIA email discussions about how robust are shale gas estimates that were, in my view, portrayed fairly out of context. EIA does some of the most credible, independent energy analysis work out there, and part of that is having a robust internal debate about emerging technologies and what their impact is going to be. In my view, the reporting was fairly selective in how it portrayed that conversation. Like any emerging technology, there are going to be divergent views about its potential. This is a fast-changing industry, and back when the reporting was referencing kind of 2008, 2009, the industry was in a much different place than it is today, and the debate was very different. I'd just say this, that without the type of data, and you can ask any energy market participant or energy company about this, without the type of data and information that EIA provides, oil market function would be significantly reduced. The ability of companies to plan long term would be significantly reduced. They provide a vital function. We are the only country on planet Earth that provides weekly accurate oil inventory data. And as a result, the entire global oil market looks to U.S. inventories weekly to try to get a sense of what's happening in the oil market. What we need to be doing is trying to get more countries to do what EIA does, not scaling back what EIA does.
Yeah. I believe, in fact, the U.S. spends a lot of time encouraging other countries to emulate and try and work up to the benchmark that EIA sets. Well, Heather, that I think is a good point to turn to you to ask you both about specifically the EIA budget cuts and your reaction to the discussion and questions about the EIA.
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. On your specific question about the EIA cuts, obviously, we share concerns that have been raised from Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, some of the issues that you raised in your recent letter, highlighting the concerns about the impacts of these budget cuts. As we talked about, the FY 2011 budget includes a reduction of about 14% from the previous fiscal year, and as the EIA Administrator, Richard Newell, has testified, the lowered funding levels will require significant cuts in data analysis and forecasting. Obviously, that's a significant concern for the administration, but I think, more broadly, it speaks to the tough decisions that the administration and Congress are faced as we look at the FY12 budget negotiations. And Congress has proposed cuts from everything from EIA to permitting at the Department of Interior. And in fact, we spent a lot of time this morning in your overview and talking about the report specifically about the need to diversify our energy portfolio and transition to a clean energy economy to get us off of this, to wean our dependence on oil and help our long-term energy picture. And the cuts proposed by the Republicans on the line of 70% cuts to clean energy programs. I think all of these issues combined are of real concern to the administration. And certainly as we head into the FY12 budget negotiations, these will be front and center for those discussions.
All right. Do you want any general responses that you want to pick up to Trevor's paper and thoughts you want to share?
Well, I think, as the report confirms, there are no silver bullets to our energy challenges, and the president has said that many times. The energy challenges that we face are made even clearer by recent unrest and supply disruption in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as by the rapidly growing demand in emerging countries like India and China. The report, at the end of the day, urges an all-of-the-above approach to enhancing our energy security, and that's exactly what this administration has been focused on. And, I think if you take a step back, where the way we think about our energy policy sort of falls into three buckets. One is what we need to do to increase and enhance domestic oil production. Despite some of the rhetoric that's out there, last year we produced more oil at home than any time since 2003. The president has announced additional steps to enhance domestic oil production, and in light of the lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, I think we've very quickly been using all tools available at our disposal to increase the bar on environmental and safety standards, but also get permitting back up and going in the Gulf. To date, we've approved over 60 shallow water permits and over a dozen deep water permits. And as companies are able to demonstrate their ability to comply, we continue to permit, because obviously, as I said, ongoing responsible domestic oil and gas production is an important part of what our country needs to do. The second piece of the puzzle is looking at efficiency. Obviously, the fastest, cheapest, and one of the most effective tools that we have at our disposal is increasing the efficiency of our transportation sector. You talked in the report about the model year 2017 to 2025 standards, but in addition to that, I think what's important to note is one of the first things the president did, one of the first days in office, when I still didn't even understand where the Oval Office was located, the president issued a directive to the Department of Transportation and EPA to work together and come up with standards for model year 2012 to 2016. We aggressively worked to come up with a proposal that had the support of both Democrats and Republicans, the state of California and 14 other states, the UAW, and all the foreign and domestic auto manufacturers. We came up with a standard of 35.5 mpg in model year 2016. That's 4 years earlier than Congress, than the law that Congress enacted. We're going to build, obviously, on that success for model year 2017 to 2025. We'll propose a standard in September, and this will be a significant, as the report laid out, a very significant part of how we reduce our dependence on oil. The last piece of this is that in the end of July, we'll be finalizing a standard for heavy-duty trucks, the first time that a joint efficiency and greenhouse gas standard has ever been set for heavy-duty trucks that will allow us to save upwards of 500 million barrels of oil over the life of the program, obviously another very important component. And then the last piece of our energy picture looks at alternatives to oil, and that includes everything from taking advantage of these new shale gas finds to use natural gas where appropriate in the transportation sector and embracing new incentives there, and also looking at the next generation of advanced biofuels. Again, this is something that the administration has invested heavily in, trying to take these new investments and new technologies to commercial scale. And through investments in the Recovery Act, through some of the programs at DOE and USDA, we believe we're making significant progress in that space. So I think, broadly speaking, all of these components are important to our long-term energy picture and what our country needs to do to secure our energy future and ultimately also have the added benefit of being good for the economy, being good for the security, and being good for the environment. So I appreciate many of the findings in the report, and as I said, I think it just underscores the need for an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and that's something that the administration is very much focused on.
So before going to McKie, let me just ask, you mentioned the natural gas shale production, so forth. Do you see that in the enhanced domestic production bucket or the alternative bucket?
Well, the good thing about natural gas is we see it in both. I think we, through a series of new safeguards and regulations that are coming out on coal-fired power plants, there will be a new opportunity for natural gas in the electric sector, which is terrific. And then, when it comes to the use or what we can do to help reduce dependence on oil, natural gas obviously can play an important role there. Building on some of the successful programs that the administration has funded to date, the Clean Cities program has been very focused on helping cities transform fleets, invest in CNG buses, and what we've seen where you can focus natural gas transportation on fleets. There's a significant opportunity there that's worth building on.
Thank you. McKie, like to give you the opportunity to respond both to Trevor, to Heather, and just your own thoughts on the kind of balance on energy security.
I appreciate it, and I want to congratulate the Institute and Trevor and Shawshank. People ask me sometimes, what's the toughest thing in terms of sorting out on energy policy? And because I think a lot of it's really simple. I said the toughest thing is there's way too much theology and not enough analysis. And in reading this through, I was really struck by how the absence of theology and the presence of analysis, and I really appreciate that. And what's going to happen up here is we're all going to agree on all of the above, because everybody always agrees on all of the above. It just always differs maybe on how much of this part of all of the above and how much of that part of all the above and how it fits in. And one of those devil in the details issues. I'm going to just lead off with just a couple of really simple things, and these are all obvious, but I'm a simple guy, is we think energy is good. It is necessary. It is the foundation of advanced civilizations and increased standards of living. And as the standards of living all over the world increase, there is going to be an increasing demand for energy. And so I think it's up to all of us to try to look and see how we can supply that and how we can use it most effectively. One of the things that I just want to start off with, because I know this is obvious, but so often it gets mixed up, is there in the whole energy debate, there's sort of two major components. There's transportation, which is almost 100% petroleum, and there's power, which is very small amount of oil. And there is a little bit of fungibility through electric vehicles, and then natural gas kind of floats back and forth there a little bit and stuff. But when we see people talking about how we have to get off foreign oil, and they're standing there in front of a windmill and talking about it, it doesn't just further that analysis. And so it is useful for us, I think, to think and keep those two different parts in mind. For us, we've done a lot of thinking about what should be the goals of an energy policy. And I've kind of wound up with Senator Murkowski's wound up with 5 real simple goals. And that energy should be abundant, affordable, clean, diverse, and domestic. And there's a tension between those five goals. But I will say, frankly, developing successful energy policy lies in being able to successfully resolve the tensions between those 5. I was also, I have to admit, I was struck with your emphasis on carbon tax. We have a bit of a soft spot for carbon tax. That may be heresy for a Republican to be up here saying.
Particularly now.
But particularly now. But let me put on some important qualifiers, please. During the whole cap and trade debate, we looked at the cap and trade effort a great deal. I personally felt the Waxman-Markey bill as it came out of the House was an environmental fraud in terms of its actual effect on reducing emissions, and I'm happy to go into why and how and the curve of how that actually would have effect. But we tried to say, is there something there that might make sense? And one of the things we wound up spending a lot of time looking at was something we called a net zero carbon tax, where you would place a tax per ton at the narrowest point of each different energy stream, and when you do that, you have to acknowledge right up front, you've not just raised the prices on energy, you've raised the prices on everything, because energy prices affect, to a greater or lesser degree, the price of everything. And so you have to acknowledge that and be upfront about it. We then would talk about taking 100%, and this was the important part, not 98, not 90 or 85, 100% of that money and refunding it to the consumers, primarily through a reduction of the FICA, the employee portion of the FICA taxes, and for those people who don't pay FICA taxes through a direct rebate. And frankly, every single economist we talked to, from far left liberal academicians to far right think tanks, said if you simply were to replace a highly inefficient tax on something you want people to do, work, with a highly efficient tax on something you don't want them to do, emit carbon, that in and of itself would have a highly stimulative effect on the economy. And we've started out by talking to folks like Americans for Tax Reform, who actually agreed they did not regard this as a tax increase, but rather tax reform, and Heritage and others. It didn't go anywhere. There was both sides. There was one side that was insistent, don't talk about anything but cap and trade. If you do, nothing else is allowed to be discussed. And then the other side is, don't talk about anything like that at all. And frankly, I think the chance for that has gone for a while, but as we proceed, there may be an opportunity again. And so I just highlight that.
One of the big themes of the paper and of Trevor's remarks is that we do all of these things, but at the end of the day, we're still part of this world oil market, and the world oil market is changing. Was it last week or the week before, the IEA machinery was tapped for only the 3rd time in its history, and there are different, views of what unfolded, how much of it was a response to disruption, how much was a response to, indeed, that there is a different kind of structure in the world oil market to which we need to respond differently, and how much of it was also focused on the economy and the economic stimulus of a tax cut in the form of lower gasoline prices. And would like to ask the three of you, beginning with Heather, to kind of respond to and help us understand the use of the SPR and this really historic decision and the context.
The president's been deeply concerned about the impact that the disruption of oil production in Libya and other countries in the Middle East has had on energy supplies and prices, and the effects of those prices on global economic growth. Since the disruption of the supply from Libya, over 140 million barrels of oil supplies have been lost to the market, resulting in a sharp increase in global prices. At the president's direction, administration officials did engage with the governments of major oil exporting and consuming countries, and that conversation and dialogue happened over the last couple of months to determine what steps could be taken to address the issue. Recently, with the decision to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that was done in full consultation with major producer countries. To reinforce the decision that was made to increase production up to 1.5 million barrels per day to meet market needs, the United States joined with the International Energy Agency partners to release collectively an additional 60 million barrels of oil into the global market during the next 30 days. It's an average of 2 million barrels a day. The United States will be releasing 30 million barrels of crude from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and I think it's worth noting that the SPRO is at an historically high level with 727 million barrels of oil stocks in it. The overriding purpose of our action was to increase supply to counter any shortfall and meet the seasonal increase in oil demand over the summer. I think what you've heard from administration officials is that the United States maintains that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is there for a very strategic purpose to help address and respond to domestic or international energy supply shortages. At the end of the first 30 days of action by IEA members, we'll review the results, and the U.S. stands ready to do more as and if necessary to address this issue.
McKie, how did it look from the Hill?
Very strange. I want to temper my remarks here, both because while we do have a lot of policy differences, Heather's a friend, and also the White House is helping us right now on some critical oil issues in Alaska, which we're very grateful for. So don't hold it against. We were just really, really puzzled. Libya's production goes mainly to Europe. There does not appear to be a crude shortage in the U.S. right now. There's a tremendous amount down at Cushing slopping around, can't get up because of lack of infrastructure. In the Gulf, there's an abundance of oil. It would seem that the main place that potential buyers, and I feel silly even talking about this because you know infinitely more about it than I do, but would be up in the Northeast where they could basically take the oil and perhaps turn around some of the tankers that would otherwise be coming to them and divert those to Europe. It seems like Europe would be the main beneficiary of this as opposed to the U.S. I will just say the sort of prevailing theory on the Hill, and I'm not trying to say this is true, it's just the theory on the Hill is that this sort of got planned back when gas prices were high, and it took a while to get all the partners to come along, and it happened now. And so puzzling, I guess.
Right. So Trevor, how does this fit into the structure that you talk about in terms of energy security?
Well, first, one of the things we highlight in the report is the importance of, for any future inventory management, strategic inventory management, that it be done in coordination with emerging markets to be effective so that China and India don't free ride off of U.S. SPR releases, and more importantly, as those countries are both filling their inventories over the next decade, that it's not counteracted by strategic inventory fills in China and India. Encouraged by reports that the IEA consulted with China and India, I'm imagining that was just consultation. There's not a formal mechanism for inventory coordination yet. That's been a perennial issue in energy security discussions. It has not gotten the attention that it deserves. It is a critical issue going forward, and needs to be raised and profile on the diplomatic agenda. I mean, the other interesting issue I think that the release this month raises is that, look, we're going into an environment where spare capacity in OPEC is going to be very tight, and where OPEC coherence is going to be very weak, as we saw from the OPEC meeting earlier this month. So OPEC's ability to serve a price moderating role as the kind of central bank of oil that they've served in the past is in question now, which does raise new fundamental questions about inventory management in consuming countries. That's a very important debate, and you can make strong arguments on either side. I think it's one that we're going to increasingly have to have going forward, because if we have a global oil market where you've got 2-3 million barrels a day of spare capacity going forward and strong demand in emerging economies, small disruptions, way smaller than Libya, are going to roil oil markets, and there's going to be a temptation and a desire to use inventory releases to smooth those over on a fairly regular basis, as opposed to the past uses of the SPR. And so I think this is going to be an important topic for discussion going forward.
It certainly is striking, given the number of countries that had to be consulted in the IEA and all those other countries, that apparently an awful lot of oil traders were really quite surprised by it in terms of intervention. I think what we ought to do is open it up for some questions from the floor, but questions should be short and to the point and not speeches. So the microphones are there if any people want to jump in. David Goldwyn, the microphone is on the way to you.
Thanks. Good morning. Trevor, a question for you. Sorry, David Goldwyn, Goldwyn Global Strategies, formerly International Energy at the State Department. If the goal is to reduce price volatility, one thing that seems to be missing from the response tool is increasing the number and quantity of oil suppliers overseas and the infrastructure to bring oil in. Because if all of these solutions together don't provide enough, we need more countries to produce more oil. So where does infrastructure from Canada, Canadian oil sands, or even the promotion of supply in West Africa, frontier countries, fit into the overall picture?
So you're talking about like the Keystone Pipeline.
Keystone Pipeline for Canada, but also emerging frontiers in West Africa, in East Africa, in the Southern Cone. The answers are all deep water, unconventional, and Arctic. So where do those issues fit into reducing volatility? What's the position? What should the position of the administration be with respect to encouraging global supply of oil?
Let me actually maybe see if Heather and McKie want to speak to that, and then I can discuss it more after Heather has to leave.
I think what the administration has tried to do is engage in an ongoing dialogue about increasing supply at home, and in full recognition that globally we have some resources to bring to bear on this challenge. Through the G20 and other venues, we have worked aggressively to try and start a dialogue about ongoing safe and responsible production increases. And I think whether it's the most recent conversation in the Arctic, or the most recent conversation that Secretary Salazar had in Brazil, or some of the work we're doing with the G20 to help them understand what we've done to increase domestic supply with a higher level of environmental and safety standards. All of those components are incredibly important as we engage in a broader international conversation.
I would basically concur. Let me use Keystone Pipeline as an example. The main resistance to it seems to be the fact that it is from the tar sands, that there's a higher emissions from it, et cetera, and that somehow if it doesn't happen, those won't happen. I think all of us know if we don't build the Keystone Pipeline, if we're not importing it, those are going to go to China, and actually it's going to result in higher emissions because of transportation and everything else. There's a lot of, I mean, that's just one example of what I refer to as magical thinking that goes on with energy policy, where that, for instance, if we don't have domestic production, then our need for oil will go away. And anyway, but no, I'll stop there, I guess. I could get wound up.
Right. Well, that's okay.
Yeah, well, I'll just say briefly, you know, in terms of, yeah,
I've seen him wound up. I'm not sure we want that.
Limited wound up.
No. Well, just, you know, I think all of us agree that it makes sense to reduce the amount of oil in our overall energy makeup, and that we need to continue to do that. But we're using, you know, what, 18, 20 million barrels a day, and it isn't going to magically go away, no matter how aggressively we do all these other things. And so we believe, you know, absolutely that for the sake of our nation's economy, for the sake of our national security, and I strongly believe for the sake of the world's environment, the more that we produce domestically and the more of that we encourage to come from friendly countries, the better. And we're nuts if we don't.
Wound up. Thank you. Trevor.
Maybe I'll just add one point on Keystone, because as you mentioned, we didn't address that in the report, which was primarily because the modeling tools we were using didn't allow us to address it. But on the environmental concerns, I mean, there's the emissions concerns about Keystone, then there's some of the pipeline transit environmental concerns. I don't have an informed point of view on the latter. On the former, when Canadian oil hits the U.S. border, from a climate change standpoint, it is pretty much the same as oil produced in the U.S. Like it or not, the current way that we address the challenge of climate change is with nation states being autonomous. So if Canada wants to pump tar sands and wants to cover Vancouver with trees to offset those emissions, that's Canada's sovereign decision. Likewise with our energy policy. We don't want our relative emission reduction decisions being dictated to us internationally. That's a strong position that we have in international climate negotiations. I think that the precedent of denying a pipeline like that based on emissions that occur outside of the U.S. border is a dangerous one. I think for a country that is not likely to be a leader in emissions reductions practically over the next 5 years, it's a particularly dangerous one, as there are countries who are going to be taking much more aggressive emission reduction actions and might look to internalize the cost of our unpriced emissions in goods that we export overseas.
I think one other thing to add is on a well-to-wheels basis, it adds about 6% above the average barrel in terms of emissions. And the product coming to the United States is comparable to other heavier oils. And obviously, they'll just be oils that will be coming by ship rather than pipeline. And as mentioned, we have this huge disparity between Brent and WTI that reflects that the fact that the infrastructure for moving oil has not kept up with the growth of both Canadian and actually the growth in U.S. production that's happening right now. Mark?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all the presenters and commenters. Mark Finley with BP. Trevor, other than a carbon tax, it looked like some of the biggest forces were fuel efficiency standards and building efficiency standards. How do you model the? Are there costs associated with those? Are they freebies? Are there unintended consequences or other dimensions of that don't show up necessarily in the modeling framework that we should be aware of?
So it's a good question. So we were explicitly not doing a cost effectiveness exercise here. There's some good work. A report put out last year by RFF and NEPI does good kind of levelized what's the cost to consumers per ton reduced or barrel saved. That's not what we were doing here. What we were trying to do with this report is see just how far do current proposals get us, not what is their relative cost effectiveness. And the reason we wanted to do that was twofold. One, to show that any individual proposal currently on the table doesn't do much, that you need a combination. And second, that even if you did all of them, you're not fundamentally changing the picture for the next couple decades. And so you need to have a strategy to deal with international oil markets. Those are the points we were trying to make. Going forward, we'll do additional additional analysis where we kind of compare levelized cost effectiveness. But it's a good point to raise, and we should be explicit that that was not the purpose. Look, if we put in place a $1,000 a ton carbon tax, it would reduce oil demand far more than any other policy modeled, but it wouldn't be the most cost-effective approach.
Heather, the electric car was hardly on the agenda in about 2006. It's certainly on the agenda now. At the same time, moving pretty fast on fuel efficiency standards. Can you give us a sense from the administration's point of view how you see, how you'd score progress so far on the electric car, and as conventional internal combustion engine cars become more efficient, does that affect the kind of competition with the electric car?
As we're in the middle of discussions about model year 2017 to 2025 with a number of stakeholders, this is obviously a key point that we spend a lot of time discussing. The president has laid out a goal of having 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2015. And I think underlying that are a number of administration policies that are worth pointing out. First and foremost, in the Recovery Act, we invested heavily in battery manufacturing. When we first came into office, we had 2 plants domestically that were building the batteries for our electric vehicles, and because of Recovery Act investments, by 2015 we'll have approximately 40% of the global market, which I think is a great success story about what we can do with proper investments, but also to ensure that the technologies of the future are built here in America. And as we are making the investments in the manufacturing side, what we need to also do is focus on bringing that price point down. And to do that involves increasing the research and development. The Department of Energy has, through a number of different programs, invested heavily in ongoing research and development, again, to improve these technologies and over time ensure that the life of the battery is longer, but also that we're bringing the price point down, which is an important piece of this broader picture and the future of electric vehicles. Obviously, when it comes to affordability for these new EVs that are rolling off the assembly line today, we have proposed a $7,500 tax credit, which has been very successful, and we'd like to see extended, again, helping bring the price point down and making sure that we're investing over the long haul in these vehicles. And the last thing that the administration has done, I think worth noting, is we have used the purchasing power of the federal government to also invest in these new advanced technologies. And the federal government, through GSA, just made a purchase of 100 EVs, and will continue to make those investments, as well as investing in the infrastructure throughout the country to make sure that we are able to recharge and make sure long term we have the infrastructure to address and help make sure these electric vehicles are a success.
Thank you. McKie, you wanted to jump in?
I do. And actually, I was trying to find something here on the BlackBerry. The day is rare that I don't get an email from the Department of Energy announcing a new clean energy grant of one type or another, whether it be EVs or solar or whatever. But the debt right now is running every single debate on the Hill. And I was up in New York a couple weeks ago talking to a group of institutional investors on a panel, and I said, personally, I would not make any long-term business plans based on anything whose whole business plan depends on ongoing subsidy. I think there really is a role, and this is frankly one of the toughest challenges in energy policy. It does make sense for the government to help nascent industries get going and get on their feet, but how you sort that out between transitional assistance and assistance that, frankly, the entire business plan is based on, and the moment you pull it, the whole project withers. How you make that is one of the very, very toughest things. But I would repeat that advice. Personally, I would not be making any kind of investment in something that depends on long-term subsidy. So we need to figure that out. I do think that a case can be made, frankly, of letting oil help pay to work itself out of a job. And because, and I don't mean to sound like the one-trick pony about domestic production here, but I will. It's one of the very, very few areas the federal government has available to it where we can actually bring in a lot of additional money. And if we do that, I think that there is at least a case that can be made that some portion of that could appropriately be used on looking at funding all other types of energy.
Right. Are there other questions? Here's a question here.
Jeff Schott with the Peterson Institute. I take the point of the panel that oil is going to be around and a dominant part of our energy picture for decades. There's an infrastructure issue that hasn't gotten much attention by the panel, and I appreciate your expertise, and that's refinery capacity. One of the reasons that the SPRO had to be tapped was because of a relative shortage of relatively light crude, while the Saudis have spare capacity on the heavier crude. That seems to indicate that one of the bottlenecks in our strategy, which is being exacerbated by the desire to have cleaner fuels, both for road transport and marine transport, is the fact that we have bottlenecks in refining capacity.
So the question is, do we have
what do we do about the refining bottleneck, and is it a real concern for the mix of energy policies that you see needed going forward?
Our refinery capacity can handle, and billions and billions of dollars of investment have gone into making it quite flexible. So it's really not a problem here, it's a problem there, I think. All right. I mean, you're balancing the system. Yes.
Yeah, Anders Åslund, Peterson Institute. I hear two different messages here. Essentially, Trevor's paper says there is a silver bullet, and that's carbon tax. And here I hear Heather Zichal saying there is no silver bullet, we have to do a little bit of everything. Of course there is a silver bullet. Energy taxes, Europe has half as high energy intensity as the United States. So it's really a political question for the US. Do you want to use the silver bullet, or do you prefer to deal with all these other small measures?
I think Trevor also said it. There's no silver, that even a carbon tax is not a silver bullet.
He was rather soft on it, but he clearly shows that carbon tax is the effective measure. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a carbon tax alone at the level that we looked at it is maybe 30-40% more effective than some of the others, but it's still pretty trivial as a single. I mean, it would, in 2035, it would reduce U.S. oil imports, carbon tax alone, by maybe 12% at the level that we were looking at. So, I mean, you could increase the price, but there's a lot of parts of the energy system that a carbon tax doesn't touch that you need complementary policies to address.
I also think part of the solution is in finding opportunities right now. And we talked about the fact that, your quote was that debt is running every conversation. We're also dealing with a pretty partisan Congress right now, but we also have seen that there are some solutions in the short and near term that have support from Democrats and Republicans, and I think that from the administration's perspective is where we should focus our effort. I mean, there are a number of bipartisan bills on everything from electric vehicles to natural gas vehicles. We're starting a dialogue with my good friend McKie and others about a potential for a clean energy standard. So I do think in the near term, the important imperative here is to focus on what we might be able to get done and what has bipartisan support.
And I also wanted to add, whether we're talking about taxes or any aspects of energy policy, it is just way too easy to simply ignore politics and say, if only, this would be the solution. And a lot of times that's true. You do this, it would be the solution. But you simply cannot ignore politics. I mean, it's one of the things that's been my observation for a long time is, we've had it well demonstrated that north of $4 a gallon, drivers change driving behavior. I think that's real clear. but it's also my observation that somewhere north of about 375, they change voting behavior.
An economist correlation. Yes.
Hi, Lisa Epifani with the law firm of Van Ness Feldman. Heather just touched on the clean energy standard, and I wanted to ask if we might expect to see any sort of legislative attempts this year on moving a clean energy standard, and also wanted to hear about the administration's positions on the ethanol subsidy debate as well as royalty rate sharing.
I think, as the president laid out in the State of the Union, the goal of a clean energy standard, we believe, is something that is has tremendous opportunity because you're not picking winners and losers. There are a lot of people that like natural gas and clean coal, a lot of people that like wind and solar. And what's important from our perspective is to start a dialogue, and we've done that. And I think the great thing about a clean energy standard is that it has attracted some bipartisan support. People recognize that it has a potential to bring capital off the sidelines and provide a long-term price on carbon, which is incredibly important to a lot of the imperatives we've been talking about today. As far as whether or not it'll move, I'll leave that to McKie to answer. On your second question about ethanol subsidies, obviously, I think we're encouraged by the bipartisan discussions in the Senate about trying to find a middle ground that will transform the VTEC, that will save taxpayers money and look at a more reasonable long-term policy that focuses on the next generation of biofuels.
And what was the third one, Lisa? Royalty rate revenue sharing.
I think we spoke directly to that in the budget. We're trying to find new tools that will help incentivize domestic production and use of latent leases, and we're focused on implementing the FY12 budget requests.
McKie, did you want to?
Just quickly, I really felt in some ways sort of sorry for the president that immediately after he came out with the 80% CES goal, which I do think is an admirable goal, we had Fukushima happen, and frankly, there's just no way I see you ever reach that without substantial new nuclear power coming online. We do have actually a little flurry of nukes coming online right now, but just as oil production, nukes, these are all things that they take a long time to come online. So what we see happening right now is the result of things and policies and decisions that were made, multiple years ago. I don't think there's anybody in a boardroom right now is saying, I know, let's put in a new nuke. I think there may be some, I think that will change and have a resurgence, and I think modular nukes and other things may have some possibility. But in the short term, it makes it very, very difficult. We have been working, I think, constructively with the administration and with Senator Bingaman on CES questions. As you all know, we put out a white paper, the Energy Committee put out a white paper, which we had a huge response, and we've sorted through those. We've been talking and going through the modeling. I think we are at a point of some fundamental disagreements. Senator Murkowski, Senator Bingaman met just a day or two ago. Probably the most bedrock disagreement is we believe if there was a CES that needs to serve as the main tool for reduction of greenhouse gases. He believes that in addition you still need to continue with the EPA's endangerment finding and regulation. I think, and I'm not trying to speak for Senator Bingaman, he may introduce something on his own. I don't see any plausible political path forward.
Let me just ask Heather one question before you run out the door, because we know you have to leave. Just give us your guidance following from what McKie is saying as to where the administration's thinking is on nuclear right now, several months after Fukushima.
As folks probably know, the President asked the Independent Nuclear Regulatory Commission to come back with in 90 days with a report. We believe, obviously, that nuclear power continues to be an important source of carbon-free energy, and that we can do that safely and responsibly. And we look forward to the findings from the NRC.
Thank you. I think there's a question.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting one.
I know it. Thank you.
I actually have two questions. but since Heather is leaving, I don't know.
I'll answer for.
Yeah, he'll clarify Heather's positions.
Well, North American gas pipeline network, how will it cope with shale gas supplies and in locations not traditionally served? And what is government or energy companies doing to facilitate shale gas transport? And the second question is about gas pipeline from Alaska through Canada. Is it dead? And will the Trans-Canada pipeline go forward, and when?
Let me try the second of those first, and then I'll defer on the first one to you guys, if that's all right. The Alaska gas pipeline is not dead, but it is challenged. The abundance of shale gas certainly affects the economics of it. I think there are a wide variety of issues that are being looked at as, do you continue with the big line, the Trans-Canada line? The state is also looking at a smaller in-state bullet line. There are people who are advocating what they call a stub to hub, which it would be a big line from the slope down into the vicinity of Fairbanks, and then smaller lines feeding off that, and state assistance to make that happen. And trying to make lemonade here. As shale gas continues to become more abundant and more power generation switches to natural gas, that may result in long-term contracts that then make the production of additional gas more economical.
The first question was about international cooperation on shale gas technology.
The infrastructure.
The infrastructure.
Oh, I'll let Dan speak.
Well, I think obviously as this capacity grows in different parts of the country, it needs a different pipeline system. It means Pennsylvania, instead of importing natural gas from Texas, is supplying its own gas. So the infrastructure is being built to accommodate it. I think what is striking is just how remarkably fast the shale gas is built up, from basically 1% of our gas supply at the beginning, a decade ago, to 25%. And I think as late as 2007, people were imagining an armada of LNG vessels bringing gas to the United States, and that's just turned around. And when you have a turnaround on that scale, it certainly involves a lot of new investment, just as we're seeing the buildup of oil supply in North Dakota and Canada requires new infrastructure to carry it. Next question.
Hi, Kevin Hall with McClatchy Newspapers. I had two political questions and a theoretical question, but Heather's left. I'll throw it out there anyway. Maybe you guys know the answer. She had mentioned two battery plants when they got here, then 40% of the market now. Is that Washington math? Has it doubled from 2 to 4, or what is the kind of anybody have a feel for how big that 40% actually is? For McKie, you had mentioned we need to do more to encourage friendly imports from friendly countries, yet every time I turn on the TV I see Republican attack ads blasting Obama for telling the Brazilians we want to be their customers. Is that dishonest? Should it stop? And then for Trevor and Dan, we talked a lot about energy security. How would you characterize where we are today versus where we're in the past? Every president since Nixon has talked about energy independence. Are we more or less secure, or about the same?
You got the attack ad question.
I'll try the Brazil part. I do, and I want to reiterate, it makes sense to encourage oil development and ties with friendly countries. But I think that to the entire oil community, to politicians and others very concerned about domestic production, it simply didn't make any sense when we were faced with tremendous challenges in domestic production. And frankly, we would love presidential support for greater domestic production, to see him down talking about we're going to bring this on in Brazil. And there there was a reference earlier to, this is additional production that's coming online right now. But as I mentioned earlier, production takes a long time to come online, and the stuff we're seeing right now is a result of things that have been in the metaphorical pipeline for quite a number of years. In Alaska, I'll just use this as an example. The TAPS line is running. We're looking at that line getting down to laminar flow and actually having to shut it down potentially in the early 2020s. And the decisions that will be made right now, this year, immediately are going to be the ones that make the difference on what happens to that line in the early 2020s. So I don't think it is inconsistent to say, yes, we want to encourage friendly countries, but we don't want to encourage them instead of us, if that makes sense.
Why are they alternatives in your mind? Say that Brazil ought to do more, does that somehow reduce less support?
No, it should not be. They should not be alternative. And the fact is, if they were cumulative, I don't think you'd see anybody objecting at all. But what you would see is at the same time you're seeing tremendous barriers to domestic production, and whether those barriers come in areas that are simply off limits or whether they come through permitting issues, and I can elaborate at great length on this, or other means, and not see that same emphasis on domestic production and instead on international production. That's the frustration. They should not be alternatives. They should be cumulative.
On the historic energy security question, I'd say we are, from an economic perspective, the U.S. economy is less vulnerable than Carter, but more vulnerable than Nixon, and certainly more vulnerable than we were just 5-6 years ago. There's a unique challenge now and going forward, and we have a chart in the brief that kind of outlines this. If you look back at forecasts made for 2008 energy demand and supply by the IEA or the EIA, they actually got the supply number right, pretty much exactly right, which in part is because 6 years ahead, you pretty much know the projects that are going to be in place. There's not a lot of room of movement. Demand in emerging economies grew much, much faster than expected. And when supply is constrained, you have to ration that demand from someone else. And that demand got rationed from the U.S. and from other developed countries through increased prices. So you have a world now where most of the incremental demand growth is coming from countries with much lower demand elasticity than in the U.S., which means that when prices go up, the U.S. bears more of the economic hit through demand rationing than emerging markets do. In China, that's because energy is still primarily consumed by industry, and income growth offsets some of the price effects. In the Middle East, it's because of subsidies protecting consumers from the real price of energy. That's a significant challenge going forward for the U.S. particularly.
Well, I was thinking of the answer to Kevin's question in pieces. I like your ability to, better than Carter, worse than Nixon, as to on a historic continuum. The spare capacity question is something you've highlighted. The geostrategic basis in the Middle East has changed. There are things, obviously, like Iran's nuclear program that hang over things, and which Trevor's alluded to, growth. I remember once the Saudi oil minister saying, kind of just more or less what you said, that it's a lot easier to figure out supply, as difficult as it is, but demand is much harder to understand, and it continually surprises. Some of the pluses are new supplies and what technology has done in ways that just, to think it was kind of one obsessed individual in Texas, George P. Mitchell, who when everybody was a skeptic, kept saying there was a way to crack the code of shale, and he did it, but it took about 15 years and a lot of calumny for that to happen. Imports, you're kind of right on the Nixon level too. I checked, of all things, last night the EIA website, as one does in preparation for this meeting, and I think our net imports are now down to 47%. It's not so long ago people were saying, somewhat incorrectly, that our imports were 2/3 of our demand, but that's a big change. And we have had in the developed countries, the United States and others, we've had peak demand. Demand is not going to grow, it's going to continue to decline, and so that's the offset. So it is those pieces, and I think kind of Trevor has some scorecards for measuring it. One thing I know, somebody's standing there, but just to ask, well, why don't you ask your question, and I have a question for Trevor.
Okay, I'll try to spit it out as quickly as possible.
That's okay.
Brian Kaufman, Natural Resource Defense Council Transportation Program. Is this on?
Yeah, I think so, vaguely.
Okay. My question is, last week we saw information leak from the administration that they're considering a 56.2 mile per gallon standard for 2025, and that is pretty close to the high range of your 3 to 6% annual increase in efficiency. And as we saw, Trevor, that was the largest kind of impact on the demand side we can do for energy security here. My question is, obviously the auto industry finds this challenging, and no industry likes regulations, especially more stringent ones. But it's one of the biggest things we can do to wean ourselves off of foreign oil. And automakers, react to fluctuations in gas price as significantly as consumers do. It hurts their balance sheet. Consumers don't want to buy high efficient vehicles if we have cheap gas.
So the question is?
The question is, with automakers supporting increased gas taxes and floors for gas prices, what do you see as the impacts on the U.S. economy if we had a floor?
A floor tax. I can't, McKie could speak to this better than I do, but I don't think that enters the realm. If carbon tax is kind of in the world of the difficult, I would say gas tax, significantly higher gas taxes in the world of the impossible. I would say kind of on those lines, there's often a view that any increase in domestic supply or better planning about domestic supply is going to lead directly to a decrease in efficiency improvements, right? Because gasoline is going to get cheaper, et cetera. Any increment in U.S. production is going to have a pretty marginal impact on global oil prices, just given our share. And in terms of thinking about the international picture, if you care a lot about, like you mentioned, if you care a lot about long-term incentives for more energy-efficient vehicles, you don't want volatile prices. It's actually not good for oil to go up to $150 a barrel and then crash down to $30, because then consumers and automakers don't know what to plan. $100 oil is plenty incentive for the development of more efficient vehicles over the long term. And so coming up with a realistic strategy on the supply side that helps provide transparency about what supply is going to be available in the market on what time frame is actually going to accelerate the development of efficient vehicles if it reduces price volatility.
I'm not sure I have anything to add, other than I'm afraid that goes into the category of the silver bullet, if only people would ignore politics, and it isn't going to happen.
Right. Trevor, you and Dan Rosen wrote that very good paper a couple of years ago on Chinese energy policy. In this paper, you sort of glancingly deal with China. But you said something that I would think, as I suggested at the beginning, would surprise a lot of people, that Blue Water Navy, China, and India actually, given that China at some point is going to be using as much oil as the United States and importing more perhaps, actually has a role in maintaining energy security on the high seas in other ways. Do you want to just share your thinking and integrate things a little bit for us?
Sure. So we've got a challenge in the U.S. that we're going to remain relying on international oil markets for decades to come, but a kind of fiscal reality that it's going to be increasingly difficult to pay to be the sole guarantor of sea lanes of control. Now, this is extremely challenging. Let me preface this. This is tough stuff. But over the long term, enlisting other large emerging economies in sharing that burden, both in terms of sea lane shipments, but also working with the Chinese on the security of oil pipelines coming in from Central Asia, because if you have a disruption in that pipeline, it's going to impact prices at the pump in the U.S. in the same way that that supply disruptions closer to home would. That's going to be increasingly important, and it's an area where, as opposed to other areas of naval cooperation like South China Sea or East China Sea, where we actually have a shared interest, and is a good place to start that collaboration on energy that can then build into a little bit more strategic trust. This is a multi-decade undertaking, and it's going to be extremely difficult.
So you say it's not happening now?
It's happening at very limited levels,
Right.
and it's tough.
Right. Last question.
John Shaga, Strategic Petroleum Consulting. McKie, I was struck by your answer that budget is driving everything on the Hill right now. The sale of the 30 million barrels of oil, if it takes place, generate roughly $3 billion. And if Heather says they do it again, more oil will be sold and more money generated. Would it be tolerated if that money was grabbed by the appropriators for other purposes, and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve were effectively reduced in inventory permanently?
I don't believe so. One of the things that we're dealing with right now within the committee, and this seems a little off track, but it's coming back, is there are in the House, many of the new Republicans have been successful in advancing and having adopted a rule that any new authorization requires an offset, and that's a floor issue, and it's proved some challenges in authorization. In the Senate, there are some senators who oppose any new authorization unless there's a repeal of an offset that has already been funded. Just about a week and a half ago, we had some folks who proposed an authorization, and they were proposing to fund it through a very minor sale of SPRO. SPRO was going to drop down 6 million gallons anyway to just actually be able to do some work on their storage, on the caverns. And almost universally, on a bipartisan basis, there was strong opposition to using any sale of SPRO to fund anything else.
McKie, since you said the budget's driving anything, do you want to give us any prediction on debt reduction, debt ceilings?
I don't know. I do know that now we're going to stay next week. We've been doing nothing for a month or so, and we're going to stay and do another week or so of it to convince the American public we're at it. And when I say things like that, I forget there are reporters in the room and then live to regret it. But
okay, I see we're going to have, I guess,
and I would only ask for
question
mercy
here and one more question there, and then we have to close.
Thank you. Richard Wallace, unaffiliated. Could you give a prediction on the success of the 2011 Nat Gas Act?
I don't know. No, you Daniel?
I mean, you're the expert, man.
No. I'm here as a person with opinions, not an expert.
Okay. So afraid not. Okay. Last question.
Okay, I'm Dick Smith. I'm retired Foreign Service. I was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Environment, and Science. My question is about an issue that hasn't specifically been raised. You've talked about the trade-offs between environment and need for additional oil, but there's been no mention of the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve, which is, I guess, still viewed as one of the largest, if not the largest, untapped oil resources. And I'd be very interested in your views of whether there is a political deadlock that just we have to forget about it, or and also what are the pluses and minuses, and whether that fragile environment.
I think for that question we ought to turn to the former Energy Commissioner of Alaska.
Well, no, I do appreciate the question, and we from Alaska, I think, feel very strongly that we should tap the oil reserves in ANWR. In ANWR, the photos that you see, if you get fundraising things about Don't Open ANWR, show beautiful mountains and things, and there are beautiful parts of ANWR. That is not the 1002 area. That's not where the oil is. That's not where anybody's talking about drilling. The 1002 area is a very flat piece of tundra, and I will say that in the 1002 area, there is about a 50 square mile area that is about 4 to 5 feet higher in elevation than the rest of the 1002 or the coastal plain, and the majority of the caribou do go to that area, that core calving area, within either to calve or within the first day or two, because the main threat to young caribous is actually, frankly, just being drained of blood by mosquitoes. It's sort of the main thing. So with a very slight elevation, there's a little bit extra breeze and a minute degree of insect relief. And I don't think anybody ever should drill on that. And nobody ever needs to. With the advances of drilling, you could basically drill all of ANWR using areas slightly smaller than the acreage of Dulles Airport. And I see people in the audience actually shaking their heads, and I advise them, I'd be happy to stay around and talk about that. I used to run the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Those were my caribou. I was responsible for them and had taken an oath to say it. But we have, 16 to 18 million, there's huge reserves there. Actually, Senator Murkowski has a directional drilling bill in that says, okay, we understand how people feel about this regardless. So what we would propose to do is be able to, from outside of the refuge, drill down and by use of directional drilling, drill in, and we could tap, we think, maybe a third or so of the reserves that are there. One of my staff folks has put together a really good PowerPoint on directional drilling and everything, but I said, Kevin, I want one more piece in this before we take it on the road. I want somebody standing in the middle of the 1002 area with a camera, and I want them to do a slow 360-degree pan, and we're going to say, this is what ANWR looks like now. And then we're going to repeat the clip and say, this is what it would look like during full exploration and develop, and then repeat the pan again and say, and this is what it will look like afterwards. So what's the problem? And I think that, frankly, the problem comes back that I talked to earlier, one of theology.
Thank you. Thank you, McKie, for joining us. Thank you, Heather, for joining us and for the contribution. We all indebted to Trevor and Shashank Mohan for this really excellent paper, and appreciate the opportunity to join you in a dialogue with it. So please, everybody, join me in thank you.
Yeah. Heather isn't here, but actually I did want to say something nice about her. We work with each other. We disagree very often on policies. At the same time, she's proved to be a very helpful person to be able to go to and realistically talk to about problems, and it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Good. And again, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Dan.